Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and we'll see how this goes. I wrote a bunch of notes down last week and didn't end up recording this, and then I recorded this, but I didn't upload it, and then as things have continued, I think I've sort of found the avenue I want to follow for this video. I'll talk a little bit about books, but I'm going to talk about some other stuff. And there have been some people who've really been posting tremendous videos trying to reconcile our minds and our consciousness with what's going on. Brian at Books did a great one. Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics did a great one. And Hannah at Hannah's Books did a fantastic one. And Hannah, of course, I hope you're safe there in DC with everything that's going on. So I want to discuss a little bit about the idea of how we educate ourselves, but how we educate our society, and focus on just some specific things. So for perspective, this is a picture from my wedding. So you can see I am actually tall. My wife is extremely tall too. And I don't... The first thing I don't think of the first thing of my wife as being an African American, who is clearly and factually was descended from enslaved humans. We know that. My father-in-law can go back how many generations it was to his last ancestor who was born in slavery and lived childhood as an enslaved human. But I think there are a lot of myths that run around with how we talk about opportunity in the U.S., how we talk about, and specifically education in the U.S., and how we talk about equality. And I want to just throw some perspectives. I don't know how coherent this is going to be, so I apologize in advance. But I'm wearing my National Parks t-shirt because a lot of times, I think it's Walt Stegner who said it, the America's national parks are our best idea. And in some ways that's true, but I really hope that as a nation we get to a point where for my kids, when they're my age or when they have kids or grandkids at some point, they can look back and say, okay, America's national parks are America's second best idea. I don't know what the best idea is, but when our national parks are our best idea, it shows how far we've got to go still. So that's the t-shirt time. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it. So there is no question that the Atlantic slave trade is one of the greatest crimes perpetuated by humans against other humans. It is irrelevant to say that there were African tribes that enslaved their fellow Africans to be used as slaves in the United States or in the British colonies or in the West Indies. There are slave trades that still exist today. That type of attitude does not accept the responsibility individuals have for their own actions or for the legacies of actions that benefit them. There's no question about that. And even within that horror and trauma, the fact that these were still humans who built human families that were then split up and separated. We saw a couple of years ago the protests around children isolated from parents by ICE and how outraged people felt and how wrong that felt. That was part and parcel of slavery. We hear people talk about the influence of not having a father at home, the influence of single-parent households, the influence of all of those things. Not having a basic family unit was part and parcel of slavery. And African Americans did the very best that they could to try and build those families. They managed to retain aspects of African culture despite the generations of social trauma and personal trauma they endured. The Herskovits-Fraser debate pretty firmly settled that they had actually retained aspects throughout all of that horror of African culture and bits of African language through all of those generations. And so they were trying to retain that sense of humanity despite their circumstances. We have myths like once emancipated, the slaves were a disaster because they couldn't manage themselves. And we see that perpetuated today in the resistance of institutions to allow majority African American communities to govern themselves. In the idea that they're irresponsible. Part of that was that in the aftermath of the Nat Turner Rebellion, slave codes shifted to the point where they couldn't even hold religious services really without a white individual there basically overseeing the service. When you talk about the First Amendment and freedom of religion, that was violated for every single one of those individuals. When we talk about religious freedom, that was violated for every single slave in the aftermath of the Nat Turner Rebellion, and before that, obviously, but in the aftermath of the Nat Turner Rebellion through emancipation, that freedom of religion was violated for those individuals. And so their ability to self-educate was almost totally removed and consistently pressed down against, so that in 1856, Robert E. Lee, noted slave owner, and that is how I'll refer to him, could write a letter in which he talked about how slavery is really awful, but it's worse for the white people than the blacks, because enslaved humans are better off here than they would have been in Africa. And that the discipline they're going to learn through slavery will eventually help them get to a point where they'll be able to take care of themselves. And so we see that myth perpetuated. We see that myth in the aftermath of Reconstruction, when an African American leader who had been in political office had the tragic scream of, "We were 8 years in power, look at all the wonderful things we did," and as soon as there was a chance, you take it away, because frankly they're regarded as subhuman. We see it in the idea that scientists define species primarily as the idea that two individuals from the same species will mate and they produce viable offspring, live offspring. And yet, beyond the birth of my own parents, there were laws in the US that would have prevented my wife and I from being married. That didn't change until the 1960s. However, it was reinforced. So there's a legacy of how individuals are not allowed to have access to education or to opportunities, and then are told that because they aren't educated enough, they don't have certain responsibilities or freedoms, but they don't have certain responsibilities because they're not educated enough, even though they haven't been allowed to become educated. We see that in the perpetuation of segregated school systems in the US, but also within what has become sort of like self-segregation. So in Arizona, for example, there are laws that allow individuals to take a tax credit donation, not a deduction, but an actual credit donation, where you're basically allowed to divert $400 if you're individual, $800 if you're married, to a school of your choice. And you then get that back in a refund from the state. Or no, it's $200 if you're individual, $400, sorry. The school one is $400 if you're married, $200 if you're individual. There's a qualifying charitable organization that is $400, $800. My apologies. I don't want to be factually inaccurate today. So a lot of families in wealthier school districts utilize that. They fund all sorts of activities through these school tax credit donations, where families say, hey, I'm paying these taxes anyways. I'm going to divert $400 of it to my school, and that, if you have 10 families that do a $400 donation, that's $4,000 for the school. That's a coach's salary. That's an entire club's budget sometimes. There are other trips, out-of-state trips, that are totally funded through tax credit donations. In low-income communities, primarily non-white communities, the school tax credit donations are an infinitesimal fraction of that. And so we have all of these myths that we perpetuate. And I think we have to be willing to start examining those. We have to be willing to examine institutions and figure out where the change needs to happen. When I think about that, I think about an athlete I once coached who had a serious problem with her leg. She had a really bad problem where she kept pulling the same muscle in her leg. And it turned out that it was all because of her running form. So even though the problem was in a specific muscle, the issue, the pain was in a specific muscle, the problem was somewhere else. The problem wasn't actually with that muscle, wasn't doing something wrong. Her running form was wrong, and that was what was creating that muscle injury. And so I think that's how I try to examine like institutions. I've primarily worked in schools that are like low income and are trying to like turn around. Sometimes they've been under state oversight. And so when we go in, the first thing we do is we basically sit down and list every aspect of the school, and we start saying, okay, how is this effective? What are the consequences of this? How are we doing this? What are we missing? Where are the gaps? And we have to be able to let go of things and change things. And that can be very hard. I think of institutional inertia, the analogy I like to use for that is a couch. We all have kind of the favorite place we like to sit on a couch. But if we always sit there, eventually we wear out that portion of the couch. We wear out the springs, we wear out the couch. It is objectively less comfortable than other places on the couch, yet we continue to go back to that spot. As I figure this out, I try to mix up where I sit at. But that's how I think of our individual inertia and institutional inertia. We keep going back to the same place on the couch because it's what we know, and there's a better space right next to it, and we have to be willing to look for that and find it. So that's primarily what I wanted to talk about. I do want to give an example of the fact that there are, brilliant African Americans out there. Obviously, there are brilliant writers. Toni Morrison, Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston. There are so many. And then you have the activists, Dr. Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, who, if you're looking at Pride Month, I would recommend find some articles or essays on or by Bayard Rustin, who was both an African American civil rights activist, but also, and primarily that's what he's known for, but also was gay and was involved in gay rights as well, and trying to, and he was very, very, very primarily civil rights. But he was, clear around human rights, and so there are all those writers. But a quick example I have is that my wife's maternal grandmother, who again is a descendant of enslaved humans here in the South, in the United States, we even know like where in Alabama that was. So her ancestors had been slaves. There had been, serious trauma between the end of slavery and her life. But as an adult, she was part of the modernization of phlebotomy practices in Chicago, and was one of the phlebotomy technicians who helped sort of like that's a common position now. People go, like when I go and have a blood test, like somebody goes and takes my blood. Those procedures in large part stayed the same from the Egyptians through like George Washington, and so some of the modernization took place in Chicago at some hospitals there, and my wife's grandmother was one of the earliest phlebotomy technicians here in the U.S. as an African American. I compare that with my wife's my father-in-law's grandfather, who during the Great Depression in the South, in Alabama, the government would provide sacks of whatever, corn, wheat, flour, which is wheat, but different oats, different things. And the rule was a family could get one, but and these were white individuals who set this up. They said, okay, if you want to come here and try to do this challenge, you can have as many sacks as you can carry. And so my father-in-law's grandfather would go, and they would make him do it in the afternoon, because when it was hot as they could get it. And he would attempt to carry 4 sacks, like one under each arm and then one in each hand like this. And he would have to troop around the town square, essentially as like an African-American circus act for this government and the local business owners, so that they could see, and he was always successful. He was a big man, so he was able to do it. But that's how he was treated. And then a generation later, my wife's maternal grandmother was helping develop modern phlebotomy. So those are people from basically the same background, and within one generation, that was what was an African American mind was capable of, And my own wife is a highly skilled nurse, super intelligent. And you know, my daughters, I sit and practice writing letters with them and things like that, because I know, you know, I have to hope that the national parks are going to be America's second best idea, and that, you know, we all have the chance to be part of figuring out what that new idea is and figuring out how to support each other through it. So that's what I have. Yeah, I don't think I'll show the books. That's what I have, but, you know, stay safe, everyone. Hope you're well.